Hello, everyone. Welcome to the wellness unit. All right, let's jump in. This will be kind of a short lecture today. Got a few videos to show and a couple topics to touch on. Like I said, let's begin. All right, so when we talk about wellness, we have to talk about stress. And quick little introduction to stress here. We all know what stress is. It's a part of life. It's a natural, believe it or not, it's actually a healthy part of life. It can be an unhealthy part of life, and it oftentimes is, especially in the way that we live our modern lives, but it doesn't have to be. And the way that we deal with stress is definitely the most important determining factor in whether or not it's a healthy or unhealthy part of life. Unfortunately, in the United States today, it is often a debilitating problem. It is something that has a very significant negative impact on a large number of people in this country today. So it's something worth studying, mainly because it's something that we would like to reduce in our lives. Not completely. We don't want to take stress completely away from our life because stress can be a very good motivator. It can cause us to engage in behaviors that are often necessary or, in the long run, actually helpful or healthy. But we obviously want to find that right balance of stress. We want stress to be a motivating factor, but not a debilitating, uh, negative impact on our health. So, real quickly, some of the ways that you can cope with stress that we're going to talk about are through medication, through exercise, and through different cognitive techniques. Specifically, we're going to be talking about meditation. So, let's jump in. Okay, some quick definitions to get out of the way. A stressor is an event or a stimulus. So, a stressor is something that happens. It could be you're paddling down the river in your kayak and you break a paddle. That'd be a stressful event. That's a stressor. It could be the fact that you burned yourself on the muffler of your lawnmower. That would be a stressful event as well. That would be a painful stimulus. So, those are two examples of stressors. Those are possible sources of stress. And the term stress specifically refers to our reaction to those stressors, our reaction to those stressful events, those painful stimuli, whatever the stressor might be. So, stress is our reaction to something. Stressors are usually what cause stress. All right. So, what happens when our body is responding to those stressors? What exactly is going on inside ourselves? Well, if you remember back to very early on in the course, we talked about the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And these two play the most important role in our body's response to stress. So, the sympathetic nervous system, this is the main culprit here. The sympathetic nervous system, if you remember, is the system in our body that gets us ready to do something. This is arousing. It's physically arousing. It's when our heart rate increases, our respiratory rate increases. There's a release of stress hormones in our body, like epinephrine, norepinephrine. And the body is getting resources ready to act quickly and decisively, to do something perhaps very violent, to run away. It's that fight or flight response, getting ready to jump into action. So, the sympathetic nervous system is the main system responsible for responding to these stressors that we encounter in our daily life. Now, let's say the sympathetic nervous system is activated, you successfully respond to a stressor, the stressor has passed, and there's no need for you to be stressed out anymore. There's no need for those resources to be at the ready. Then your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. And this is the exact opposite. The parasympathetic nervous system calms you down. It returns your body to that homeostasis baseline. Your heart rate decreases, your respiratory rate decreases, those stress hormones are removed from your bloodstream. So you calm down in a very real way. So that's the normal, healthy way to respond to a stressor. The body gets ready for action, you do something, after the stress passes, the stressor passes, the stressor is dealt with, then the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, you calm back down, and so on and so forth. Rinse, reduce, reuse, recycle, happens all over again, all throughout the day, all throughout our lives. So here we go. This is the normal cycle. We'll start down here in the bottom right. This is our stressor. The sympathetic nervous system is activated. We are physically aroused. We use those resources that are mustered up to cope with the stressor. The stressor is dealt with, and then we return to homeostasis. We're calmed down, heart rate is normal, breathing rate is normal, and then we're walking around our environment, and boom, we find another stressor, and the cycle starts all over again. And this repeats itself, maybe a handful of times throughout the day. Now, what can go wrong in this cycle here? So again, this is the normal, healthy stress response. So what screws up when the system doesn't work right? Well, let's talk about that. So the sympathetic nervous system was built to respond to short, temporary stressors. Specifically, it was built to respond to predators, critters that want to eat us. How many predators do you deal with on a normal basis today? How many times are you chased by a lion or a cheetah or a tiger or a bear? That's a pretty rare event. It might happen if you're extremely unlucky, maybe a dozen times in your whole life. It just doesn't happen these days. That is not a stressor that is a normal part of our daily life. So in a very real way, the sympathetic nervous system is maladaptive. The sympathetic nervous system was built for an environment that we no longer live in. It evolved to help us handle temporary stressors that can be taken care of in a matter of seconds or a matter of minutes. But that's not what happens today. So if the sympathetic nervous system is activated for prolonged periods of time, this can be damaging and this can be exhausting. So if your heart rate is elevated for a long period of time, if your respiratory rate is elevated for a long period of time, if those stress hormones are floating through your bloodstream for a prolonged period of time, that can cause some negative health impacts. And this is what we call general adaptation syndrome. So, general adaptation syndrome typically has 3 phases. In phase 1, we call this the alarm reaction phase. So this is when the stressor is present. So you've got something in your environment that causes you stress. Your sympathetic nervous system becomes activated. Those resources that your body has are mobilized. Your body is ready to do something, ready to respond to that stressor. Phase 2 is what we call the resistance phase. This is where physical arousal remains high, but you fail to cope with the stressor successfully. So that stressor stays in your environment. It stays there, causing you more stress. So your physical arousal remains high to hopefully eventually deal with the stressor. But again, you're failing to deal with the stressor. You're not removing it from your environment. You're not getting away from it. So your body thinks you still need those resources to deal with that stressor. So your sympathetic nervous system remains active. Eventually, you will reach phase 3, the exhaustion phase. This is where the sympathetic nervous system has had those resources mobilized for so long. Your body has been in this super heightened wound up state for so long that you start to see these negative health impacts. And for example, those could be your immune system starts to malfunction. It's not functioning as it should. It's not fighting off infections, diseases, viruses like it should. And this is where we also see increased aging effects. So sped up aging effects. Here is a great example of those aging effects. This picture on the left is Abraham Lincoln on the day that he was sworn in as president. So that would be, I want to say 1861, right at the beginning of the Civil War. Obviously, being president through the American Civil War would be an extremely stressful position to be in. The picture on the right is Abraham Lincoln after he is sworn in for his second term. So there is a time difference of 4 years between these two pictures. And I can tell you that is a lot more than 4 years of aging between those two pictures. So obviously, stress had a pretty negative impact on Abraham Lincoln's life. I've got a YouTube video linked on the course website here. This is a video showing someone running with the bulls in Spain. And go ahead and watch that video. They've got some equipment hooked up to a guy who's running with the bulls, and you can see his heart rate and respiratory rate respond to those stressors. That's a great example of how our sympathetic nervous system is supposed to be used. That is one of the few examples of where we actually have exposure to big animals that want to kill us in our modern life. So go ahead and watch that. It's pretty interesting. All right, so let's talk about coping with stress. This is going to be a major focus of the lecture today, is how we cope with stress. As you can probably imagine, there are healthy, useful ways to deal with stress, and then there's unhealthy ways to deal with stress. So one of those unhealthy ways is emotion-focused coping. This is when we're presented with a stressor, a stressful event. Let's say in this little example here, it's a tough math test. You've got a math test coming up. It's going to be difficult. So that's a stressful event. If you appraise that stressor as, yikes, this is beyond me, it's a threat, I can't handle this, that is likely to cause you to engage in emotion-focused coping, which means that you're overwhelmed, you're stressed to distraction, your stress is negatively impacting your ability to prepare for that math test. So if you focus on your emotions related to that stressor, you're likely to be overwhelmed. So in this case, you're specifically addressing your emotional response. But if you appraise that stressor a little differently, if you see it as a challenge and you say something like, I've got to apply everything I know, that is what we call problem-focused coping. That's where you are focused on the stressor itself, not your body's emotional response to the stressor. You're focused on the stressor itself, the math test. That will likely cause you to be a little bit more focused. You realize it's going to be a challenge, but it's something that you are going to do your best to be prepared for and use all the tools at your disposal to do well on that math test. So these two different coping strategies have pretty profoundly different outcomes. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the classic research on stress. And we're going to look at some rat research. So back in the mid-80s, a group of scientists did a little experiment with rats, and they put them in stressful environments, and they studied what happened. So in this experiment that we're going to talk about, there was two comparison groups. In the first group, there was a cage that had a rat in it, and the floor of that cage had an electric grid on it. And there were shocks that would go through that grid every once in a while, and they were painful. And the rat found out that they could turn off those shocks by turning a wheel that was placed in their cage. And they learned that pretty quickly. The shocks came through, it was painful. They started freaking out, started doing a bunch of things. One of the things they did was turning that wheel, and they learned, hey, I can stop these painful shocks by turning the wheel. So, pretty quickly, as soon as those shocks came on, they sprinted over to the wheel, turned it as fast as they could, and the shocks stopped. So, that's group one. Group two is a little bit different. Same type of cage with the electrified grid on the floor. This time, there was no wheel. The rats could not turn off the shocks, but the rats in group two were shocked whenever the rats in group one were shocked. And same thing, the shocks in group two were turned off whenever the rats in group one turned that wheel. So the rats were shocked the same number of times. They were stressed or presented with the same stressor the same number of times. Now, what happened between these two groups? The first group had no negative health effects. They were compared to a control group that didn't receive any shocks, and the rats in group one were just as healthy, just as unstressed as those rats. Group two, we actually saw some negative health effects. Their health was a bit decreased. They showed those signs of decreased immune system, increased aging. So what's the difference between these two groups? Perceived control. That's the big idea here. The rats in group one, they had control over those shocks, and they knew it. They had that sense of perceived control. So their locus of control is what we call internal. They were able to a large extent, control when those shocks came and when they stopped. And they had a sense of that. The rats in group two, they didn't have that at all. Their locus of control was external. So they had no perceived control over the stressors in their environment. And that is the big difference. And this is something that researchers have explored quite a bit more in other studies and other experiments. And it has a powerful impact on how we experience stress. If you have that internal locus of control, there's so many positive things associated with this. And study after study has shown this. People who feel like they are in control of their environment, in control of their stressors, they tend to have better academic achievement, better relationships. That means better family relationships, better friendships, better romantic relationships. They're healthier. People seem to be getting healthy impacts from them. People with an internal locus of control tend to put in more effort when they're learning new skills. They don't give up very easily. They tend to have better overall health, both physically and mentally. The exact opposite is true for people who tend to have an external locus of control, people who think that stressors are out of their control. They put in less effort to learn new skills, and they have worse overall health, both physically and mentally. So there seems to be something very, very important over how we perceive these stressors. Do we have control over them, or are they out of our control? Even if it's not true, even if we are tricking ourselves, if we're fooling ourselves into thinking that we have control over the stressors in our environment, we will still see these health benefits. So even if we're just a little bit delusional, we're still going to have better overall health. We're still going to see this effect. So how do we cope with stress? Well, we talked about emotion focused and we talked about problem focused. So the key takeaway here is to take control of the stressors in your life, or at the very least, trick yourself into thinking that you can take control of the stressors in your life. Attack them directly. Don't avoid them. Don't let them hang around in the back of your mind and grow into these unmanageable, huge issues. Try to view them as challenges, not threats. View them as growth opportunities. View them as a way to learn a new skill. View them as a way to challenge yourself, to test yourself. And I'm not saying I'm good at this. I'm not saying that this is easy to do, but this is what the research shows. If you're able to do this on a daily basis, if you're able to make a habit of these things, then you will have less stress in your life. One of the main things here is to avoid prolonged stress. So that's where we talked about general adaptation syndrome, where you're stressed for too long and you start to see those negative health effects. Being stressed is not a bad thing. Being stressed for a long time, that's a bad thing. In my personal life, I tend to cope with stress with physical exertion. I like to exercise a lot. I like to go mountain biking. I spend a lot of time in nature, paddling my canoe, and I spend a lot of time running, especially trail runs. So that's some of the ways that I personally cope with stress. I hope that you guys develop some strategies of your own that help you deal with the stressors in your life, because we will never be able to completely get rid of stressors in our life, but we have a lot of control over how we cope with them. All right, and we're going to move now to talking about meditation. And this is something that is getting a lot of attention recently in the psychology literature. It's been around for a long time, literally thousands of years, but it's never really gotten that scientific attention that it deserves. So let's talk about it. What is it? Well, at its basis, meditation is ignoring distractions. You do your best to set yourself up in a quiet place, a quiet environment that allows you to have as much control as possible over your thoughts. So that's what I mean by ignoring distractions. Most people find success in meditation by focusing on one thing or nothing. Focusing on one thing is a lot easier than focusing on nothing. So most people usually focus on one thing and work their way up to focusing on nothing. It sounds so simple, but it's actually quite difficult to focus on nothing. The one thing that most people start out focusing on is your breath, just breathing in and out, focusing on that, tuning out everything else, trying not to let your mind wander. But if it does, just bring it back to focusing on your breath, that one thing. And one thing we do know is that during meditation phases, during meditation sessions, people have a lot of activity going on in their prefrontal cortex. That's what I mean by PFC. And the prefrontal cortex, you've heard me mention this before, but that's the part of your brain right behind your forehead. It's the foremost part of your brain. It's the most recently evolved part of your brain. So this is where we have things like higher order thought. This is where a lot of people think that our conscience is. This is where we have a lot of abstract thoughts as well. So the prefrontal cortex, pretty cool, plays a pretty big role in meditation. All right, so what goes on during meditation? There's a lot of different ways to do it, but like I said, one way that a lot of people have success is by focusing on one thing, usually your breath. And what is your breath? It's very repetitive. There's the breathe in, breathe out, over and over and over and over and over. And time again, we see that most meditation practices around the world use some sort of repetition. Um, if you've ever seen, nuns or monks use the rosary, that is a form of repetition. That's actually a form of meditation from a scientific standpoint. There's many ways to do this, but some of the common impacts that we see or common reactions to meditation that we see, there's an increase in positive symptoms related to stress and a decrease in negative symptoms. related to stress. So we're able to deal with stressors better. We see them as challenges, not threats, and we see a reduction in those negative symptoms. So our sympathetic nervous system doesn't stay activated for those prolonged periods of time. And also, specifically in the prefrontal cortex, we see an increase in the density of cortical tissue. So we see an increase in the density of our prefrontal cortex. It gets beefier. We're essentially flexing that muscle to the point that it gains strength. And we also see an increase in connections to the limbic system. What goes on in the limbic system? That's where our emotional processing takes place. So if we have an increase in connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, that implies that we have greater emotional control. So again, it's just like a muscle. If you use your prefrontal cortex often, if you strengthen it, it's going to have these increased benefits in your mind, in your brain. I've got 2 more YouTube videos linked here. This is talking about a woman in London who had or has a very high pressure job. She's an executive, a business executive, and she sort of has a breakdown, and she talks about this and the way that she found to cope with the stresses of her job is to engage in meditation, and she really likes it. And she talks about it quite a bit. It's a great little video, like 2 videos. All right, so that's kind of one of the takeaways from this lecture is to think about meditation. It is an extremely powerful, extremely simple, extremely easy, it's cheap, it's free, extremely easy way to deal with stress. And like I said, it has some pretty profound positive health impacts. One thing that it needs to separate from is public perception. I think this is definitely changing, but there is some negative perceptions of meditation out there. It's kind of for snobby people. It's maybe like a religious, like an Eastern religious practice. That's not true. It doesn't have to be affiliated with religion. It doesn't even have to be affiliated with spirituality. It can just be something that you do on your own time, in your own room, to help you reduce stress. So to that end, I'm going to encourage everyone listening to this lecture to go ahead and give it a try sometime. Just set a 10-minute timer on your phone, turn off all distractions, and try for 10 minutes to just focus on your breathing, in and out, in and out. Try to remove all the other distractions from your mind. Try not to let your mind wander, but if it does, no big deal. Just bring your mind back to focusing on your breath, in and out. You'll probably notice some pretty profound impacts right away. All right, before we move on to this next topic, I'm pushing right up to my 30-minute time limit here. So I'm going to pause this video and get the next one started.